Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Engage podcast. Oh my goodness, this is so exciting. We just had a thought to ourselves after the election finished, and we were thinking to ourselves, let's stop the podcast. But then the outcry, the sheer rage of the masses was overwhelming, and we decided we've got to keep this going. So do you want to explain to all our wonderful, loyal watchers, listeners, why we're carrying on with the podcast, Peter?
Oh, well, I think there's lots of ways to answer that. I think we have been so encouraged by the way in which people have responded, the amount of people who have been watching or listening in. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
I think we're also conscious there's lots to still talk about. And even in this particular little season post-election, there's still various election-related things to kind of cover as the new government begins its work.
Next question from me, and a super important question just before we
go on.
Well, no, just before we get into the nitty gritty, as they say, is could you just give me a quick update on the cricket score? Because I know you've got it up because you were boasting about that earlier. So what are we on?
269 for 4.
Still for 4. Okay, so Stokes and Pope are still in.
Wonderful. That's correct.
Very good. Stokes needs a score, doesn't he?
He does, but that is a podcast for another day. I'm sure we can have our own.
The rest is cricket. That's what we should launch.
No one's yet come up with that title.
Do you know, we should actually just launch that, because after all, Rest is Politics is our sister podcast. Rest is History is our sister podcast, and Rest is Politics is our cousin, and the Rest is Football is our distant auntie, but the Rest is Cricket. That's our calling.
Yeah.
We'll do a bit more Engage, but to be honest with you, I think we should be. Well, look, you're absolutely right. Lots to talk about. So, King's Speech.
Yeah.
But before we do that, maybe just what's your main takeaway of the last couple of weeks since the election result? We had Keir Starmer crowned, no pun intended, as the new Prime Minister. He kissed the hand of the monarch and so on. A cabinet appointed. They've had their first couple of meetings. There's been a flurry of news stories all about what different ministers are up to, and negotiations between Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, and the Doctors' Union and Junior Doctors' Union, and so on and so forth. What's your general sense of how the first few weeks have gone?
I think Labour are very keen to portray themselves as a government who get things done. And a government who are not going to be riven by the factions which were so dividing the Conservatives. I think there's a real narrative which they're trying to come up with, which, I mean, let's be real, does have some merit to it. It's not out of nowhere. That they are going to try and behave in a grown-up way, whereas before, those big bad Conservatives over there just spent their whole time arguing, which arguably they did. And so I think that's probably my main takeaway. I think there's also an interesting question, which we probably won't come on to today, about what is the future of the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
In that you have an electoral drubbing like that, and then you are, of course, asking existential questions, and then you've got questions about who is going to run for leadership. I was seeing that Priti Patel's going to run in the headlines yesterday. Tom Tugendhat's almost certainly going to run. You've got an opportunity for James Cleverly to run. Kenny Badenoch might run. So that's also a fascinating thing too. But we might say that perhaps too much time has been spent over the last X months from columnists and indeed podcasters talking about the inner workings of the Conservative Party, and they are no longer our government.
Yeah, well, that's very true. And so now we need to talk about the inner workings of the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And something you and I are woefully ill-qualified to talk about. No, but I also think it's worth just saying that we are in what would traditionally be known as a honeymoon period for a new government. And this can vary in length. It can run on for months. It can run on for a lot less time. And I remember back in 2007 when Gordon Brown finally achieved his life ambition of becoming Prime Minister, that he was immediately hit by crisis after crisis. So there was a terrorist attack, there was an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, then there was another attempted terrorist attack, and in the end, actually the terrorist attacks thankfully caused very little in terms of damage. We'd call them failed terrorist attacks, and the foot and mouth outbreak was largely contained, but it allowed him to play the crisis manager, which happened to suit him very, very well, and so his honeymoon period ran on for a good few months. What we've not seen yet in these early weeks is a major crisis happen, and I think that's partly because the Labour narrative is, well, we've inherited a crisis situation. And when you frame it like that, then if an actual new crisis comes along, that you just go, oh, well, it's business as usual. Whereas we saw the first, pushback from the new loyal opposition by Rishi Sunak, who's still acting leader for the Conservatives until they have their leadership contest, in saying, particularly when it comes to the economy, hold on a minute, actually, things were improving under my watch. And so you inherited a pretty decent economic situation, at least one that was getting better. And so you begin to see how maybe the next few months will shape up, with Labour desperate to keep showing that everything's dreadful because that's their rationale for all that they're doing. The loyal opposition pushing back and saying, actually, do you know what? You're now in charge and you now have to try and fix some of these problems that we couldn't fix.
Yes, my prediction would be that they will first start getting more pushback when it comes to the winter, when you'll end up with another crisis in the NHS around waiting lists. But I also agree with what you were just saying there, that their strategy will be, but look what we inherited, we can't just fix this all overnight. And that strategy can really cut through. So if you think back to when the Conservatives took power in 2010, the next 5 years, I guess, dominated by austerity measures in order to try and bring the economy back under control. And the narrative, years on, I mean, even sort of in like the election this year, you still get, but Labour ran out of money back in 2010, which probably isn't actually really very fair anyway, given a worldwide financial crisis.
Yes.
But that was still the prevailing narrative. So these things do cut through. Yeah. And I think that is what is likely to happen actually as the years go on here, is Labour will still keep going, but there was a crisis in the NHS.
Yes.
There were no more hospital beds and it's all the Conservatives' fault and you can never trust the Conservatives on this again, because that is just how politics tends to work.
Sure. As we think then about the King's speech, I think it's worth us doing two things to set this up. First, I think we should talk a little bit about, what is the King's speech? How does it
think that's a very good idea
in our democratic system? And then secondly, I think if we're going to assess the King's speech from a Christian stance, then it's worth just thinking through what are some of the big, broad principles that we think sort of biblically should help us analyse what's going on. Because otherwise we're left at the mercy of, you go through a list of by the way, 40 bills, and you're left kind of going, the planning and infrastructure bill, I don't think there's anything to object to in that necessarily. National Wealth Fund sounds good. Maybe I'll get some. Bank resolution recapitalisation bill. Well, that's one I'm particularly passionate about. Instead of approaching it like that, we want to look at it kind of more from that biblical perspective. So hopefully we can model that. Firstly, Peter, King's speech. Well, what the heck is the King's speech?
A King's speech is where the government basically sets out its priorities for the next parliamentary session. So these are the bills which it wants to pass through and be passed. So normally a bill takes between 6 and 9 months to go through Parliament. And so this kind of represents, here are Labour's big things it wants to sort out first. Yeah. So you can sort of tell a little bit about the priorities of a new government from what it is putting forward at the start.
And one of the things that I think you should be doing is you should be looking at the King's speech and you should be seeing clear connections to the party's manifesto.
We would hope so, yeah.
We talked about this ad nauseum on the incarnation of this podcast that has just recently finished, called the Gauge 24 podcast, where we said, look, the manifesto matters because that's how we hold the government's feet to the fire. And so I think what was interesting was the way this speech by His Majesty the King was framed. It was grouped around Labour's 5 missions. So I thought I'd test you now. So without looking, do not look.
Okay,
do not look.
Okay,
you were confidently saying earlier that you could reel them off that.
No, I wasn't saying that. That sounds much more like a statement you would make.
That was, and I think you remember I did reel them off successfully. So now is your turn. I did do that only about 5 minutes ago before we started recording. So this should be easy. Mission number 1
is to do with economic growth,
and stability. Mission number 2.
Do I have to do them in order?
Yes, please.
Oh, that's very rough.
Life's tough.
I don't know where I could do them in order. So I can give you
clean.
Okay, no, I know what you mean. It's about sort of energy security and particularly an emphasis on renewable energy sources.
Yes.
So green energy, I think it's called.
And that's the whole thing around Great British Energy. It's going to be a firm that's all about investing and buying into sort of clean energy, that kind of thing. Yada yada yada. Okay, what I mean by yada 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 is simply etc. etc. That wasn't a kind of skeptical comment about. I'm not a climate skeptic.
Really?
No, what do you mean? You always... Do you know what? This entire podcast, I thought this was Engage 24. This was the narrative you were constantly trying to frame. You tried to frame me all the time as if I was some kind of slightly to the right of Genghis Khan politically. And there was you, the beacon of moderation, of centrist politics. You were the centrist dad of the Engage 24 podcast world. And I just want to say, in this new Engage podcast world, I think we both know how we both voted at the election. And all I'm going to say is one of us was more progressive than the other.
But one of us also voted tactically, as I recall.
Yes, yeah, well, good. The third mission, because you've struggled a little bit so far.
Third one is to do with fixing the NHS reform.
Yep. Okay. Fourth mission.
Britain's streets being safer.
Correct. Fifth mission.
Equal opportunities for all.
There we go. And that was the way. Well done, by the way. That was the way in which
there we go. I'm opening this back up again.
No, fair play, and just a quick note that I'm looking for a cricket score soon. And I think the main thing here is that this was how they grouped the King's Speech, and that is important because they're trying to show continuity with what they said before the manifesto, what they said during the manifesto, and I think what we want to say as well is it gives the King's Speech a narrative as well, and the narrative is exactly as we've been talking about. Britain is broken. We're going to fix it. It's about a decade of national renewal that begins now, and here's our initial offering to try to sort things out. A couple of things struck me just big picture wise. Firstly, there was a huge number of bills in this King's Speech. So for reference, there's 40 bills, 4 of which are draft bills, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Some of them were bills that weren't finished in the previous parliamentary session that have carried over. And so not all of this is brand new from Labour. They've picked up some of the Conservatives' ideas, like the football governance review, and they've said, we want to carry that on. 40 bills is the second highest number of bills since 1997 and the highest since 2005. So this is massive. One more comment on that. The other thing that I found interesting was a lot of these bills are single issue bills. And so they're actually going to be quite small, which means they won't necessarily take that long to get through Parliament. So with a normal government bill, anywhere between 6 months and 9 months to make it all the way through from first reading to royal assent. Whereas I think some of these will be on the shorter end of that. Couple of bills are what we would call Christmas tree bills, which simply means you can hang a lot on them. And for example, there's a crime and policing bill. And I think that is significant because over the last couple of years, since 2021, every serious legislative attempt to try to pass an amendment to decriminalise abortion has been via an amendment to a policing bill. So expect to see another attempt on the crime and policing bill, I would have thought, when it comes to the whole decrim of abortion thing.
I think that's a really helpful thing to flag. To reiterate, the 40 things which are here, they are not the sum total of things which are going to be considered in Parliament.
No, absolutely not.
Campaigners will look for ways to bring in their own particular hobby horse. And parachute them onto something bigger.
Absolutely. And coming back to the draft bills, I mentioned that there were 4 of them. So 3 of them are under the break down the barriers to opportunity subheading in the King's Speech. You have a draft leasehold and commonhold reform bill. I mean, it would be great if this government finally sorted out the feudal, medieval, archaic system of commonhold and leasehold and freehold that we have. I mean, you and I have both experienced this. Our producer Isaac may have come across this as well in terms of, particularly in my shoes when we were buying a flat. It's just crazy. There's a draft equality, race and disability bill. So this is not focused on the gender pay gap as much as it's focused on economic pay disparity between people of different ethnicities and people with disabilities. And then also draft conversion practices bill.
I mean, is it worth us just kind of zoning in on that one a little bit, because it's getting a lot of attention in Christian media currently.
Massively, yeah. Worth just saying that there's one more draft bill as well, but let's focus on that. A draft bill, what that simply means is that the government will introduce a bill in draft form, and it has additional stages of what's called pre-legislative scrutiny, which means stages of scrutiny that happen before it's formally introduced into Parliament. And it will be publicly consulted on, and there'll be probably a joint committee of both houses that will come together and produce a report. And the reason that this matters, the reason this is so important, is it is a concession by the government of how difficult it is to legislate in this area. And it also means that it is unlikely we will see this becoming law anytime soon. Because if you think 6 to 9 months with a normal bill, pre-legislative scrutiny can take just as long, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. So you could be talking about a couple of years. Who knows what will happen over that time? And yeah, let's talk about it. Why do you think it's gained so much traction in Christian media?
Well, I think there has been quite a lot of concern that activities which would be seen as just regular Christian practice might be criminalised. So it's very difficult, I think, with a conversion therapy ban to know exactly what we're talking about. Because on one level, I think Christians hopefully would agree that any abusive practice against someone who is LGBT is wrong, and Christians ought to actually be at the forefront of speaking out against such practice. Because we recognise that everyone is made in the image of God, whether they are gay or straight.
And the irony here, of course, is that our starting point is we don't identify someone according to their sexuality. You've just articulated it. We identify you first and foremost as a human being made in God's own image. And when that's your starting point, you can affirm their dignity and affirm that they are made by God, loved by God, made to know God, before you even have to get into the weeds of what do I think about their sexual practices.
Completely. And so there have clearly been some really awful things which have happened. And I think, again, that has been much publicised. It's very widely known. In the past, you've had things like electroshock therapy, which are really horrifying. But even today, within certain parts of the church, you still occasionally hear really awful stories of where someone has effectively been exorcised.
Yeah.
And again, I would really want to say that is wrong.
Yeah.
It is not demonic in that way. I think the big place where often we have gone wrong as Christians is we have almost portrayed it as if what we want for someone who is attracted to people of the same sex is for them to suddenly be attracted to people of the opposite sex. And that is not what the Bible would say, because the Bible is not concerned with that. The Bible is concerned with holiness. So a better story for someone who is homosexual is not for them to become heterosexual. It is for them to become holy like Jesus. And so we have to be really, really careful to make sure that we get the narrative right, as opposed to saying, look, you need to change to be something else, because that's not what the Bible would say.
We can end up, I suppose, in terms of the blessings of the gospel, we can end up turning it into, isn't the gospel great because you receive Christ and you receive a new identity and you receive forgiveness of sins and adoption. Oh, and by the way, you'll become heterosexual as well.
Yeah, and that's so damaging,
I think that's right. I also think, it is worth saying that 1 Corinthians 6, where the Apostle Paul has that famous list of sins, including homosexual practice, but then he says, and such were some of you, but you were washed, you were cleansed. I think, what we can say in the grace and the power of God and in his sovereignty, there are cases where actually somebody who previously practiced a homosexual lifestyle is converted to Christ and then actually does enjoy the blessings of a heterosexual marriage.
And again, there are plenty of examples of that. So Rosario Butterfield would be a very prominent example within an American context. Jackie Hill Perry would be another one within an American context. Within a British context, someone like Sean Doherty or Peter Ould. These would all be people to whom that description would apply. I guess the thing to round off, I guess, our comments on that is, I think there is some evidence that sometimes there is a bit of fluidity in sexual preferences, particularly actually amongst women. And we certainly, obviously, we believe in a God who can do anything, but we do not believe that God has promised to do this. It is possible that someone might experience change, but God has not promised that he will bring change in desires. And so that's where I think we need to be really, really careful, in that we're trying to tread that fine line between saying, actually, that we don't want to put limits on what God does do because he's God, but also let's actually make sure we're aiming for the right thing. And the right thing is not to like change from being gay to straight. The right thing is to make sure that you become like Jesus, and that will mean, if you're attracted to the same sex, pursuing a life of celibacy.
Yeah.
But it does not necessarily mean you have to suddenly be attracted to people of the opposite sex.
And at the heart of the gospel is you find your identity in Christ.
Yeah.
You're a new creation in Christ. I mean, ultimately, that is what matters. And that will then lead to, with the power of the Spirit, a changed life. But as you're rightly saying, that does not automatically mean that your changed life must involve heterosexual marriage and et cetera, et cetera. And I think, the other thing worth saying on this is, the specific concern that I think we and many other Christians would have is there are people in society who are agitating and campaigning for a broad conversion practices ban.
Yeah.
And a broad conversion practices ban, we think, would end up criminalizing, for example, pastors and church leaders having conversations with people about unwanted same-sex desires and attractions, and pointing them to Jesus and pointing them to the gospel, but that in itself being a criminal act. Or another example, because Labour have promised to introduce a fully trans-inclusive conversion practices ban. Let's say you've got two parents and their teenage daughter comes to them and says, I believe I was born in the wrong body, I'm struggling with this, I want to go through some kind of reassignment surgery, change my biological identity in that way. And if they, from Christian principles, or maybe even not even Christian principles, tried to counsel their daughter, no, we don't think that's the right path, let's help you live with the biological sex that you have, that there's a broad conversion practices ban could actually criminalize the parents in that matter. And from a Christian perspective, the reason that both are wrong is that is then the state stepping into the jurisdiction of, firstly, the church on a doctrinal matter, and secondly, the rights of parents as the chief guardians of their children. So that's in a summary form, that's a big concern.
I think that's really helpful. And one of the things which I think has made me feel far more nervous on this issue is when sometimes within conversion therapy legislation, you get the idea of suppression of desire being a bad thing. And actually, as Christians, we believe that regardless actually of whether you are gay or straight, if you are not married, you are to suppress your kind of sexual urges.
But also, if I came into work and I had a desire to steal from you, or to let's ratchet this up a little bit, and I'm not, by the way, drawing a comparison, but let's say I had a really malicious desire to hurt you in some way. The idea here is not that I must suppress that desire. That desire is not a good desire that I must therefore follow.
Yes. So not all desires are good, because the human heart is not good. And this is not, again, to minimise the struggle of people who go through this, but it is to say that it has always been Christian teaching that we don't just enact whatever sexual desire we have.
No, that's
because we believe that sex is for within a marriage covenant, and we believe that means when you're married, you are faithful to your spouse. It means when you're not married, regardless of who you're actually attracted to, you don't have sex.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking then about the broader kind of King's speech, and I think helpful to focus in on a piece of legislation in the King's speech that has already been an area of massive concern for Christians and will continue to be. But I think one of the things we also wanted to do with this podcast was to kind of demonstrate that if we're Christian, we also are going to have views and have an interest in more than just the conversion practices bill. And so we want to demonstrate that now. I guess as I look at this, my starting point is I want to be thinking, well, what does the Bible say I should expect from government? And why not start there? And for me, if I'm going to start there, I'm going to start with Genesis 9.
Yep.
I'm going to start with the covenant God enters into with Noah and with the created order post-fall. I'm going to start with Genesis 9 verse 6 in particular, with the very famous legal text where God places a protection on human life. And the assumption that I'm then making is that this is God's way of saying to Noah and his family that as you procreate, as you populate the earth, you will have to set up institutions that will govern a growing population and will adjudicate between human beings when disputes arise. And the chief responsibility, therefore, of government as one of those institutions is to protect human life and to make sure that the image of God in humanity, which although defaced is still present after the fall, is upheld and respected. And whatever the New Testament goes on to say about the role of government is, I think, built on that foundation. That's where it begins. And the key thing with the covenant that God does post-fall Genesis 9 is it's a gracious covenant that is, some theologians call it the common grace covenant. It's not just with Noah, it's with all who will come forth after Noah, because this is God setting the stage and saying, I will not flood the world again in the way I've just done until Christ comes back. That will be the end of history, essentially. That's really important.
Sure. So I guess what you're sort of saying there is that actually human authority structures are legitimate.
Yes.
And actually, I guess, as you sort of alluded to, within the New Testament, we have that teaching, don't we? That all who lead government have been effectively placed there by God.
And that comes over so clearly, of course, in Romans 13. And even before you get to Romans 13, there's the famous account of Jesus in the Gospels with the coin, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, to God what is God's. And the key point there, two things. One, Jesus legitimizes pagan, un-Christian authority as God-given, but he frames it in the context of any authority that Caesar has is secondary to the even greater authority that God has. And then when you get to Romans 13, you get the very famous, essentially any government that God gives us, he has ordained. The language is really fascinating. It's the same kind of language as applied to ministers of the gospel. They're his servants. They have a very specific job to do. So just very quickly, Romans 13, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God, so on and so forth. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. And so that then is our starting point.
Yeah, and I guess actually picking up on exactly where that ended. So you talked about punishing what is wrong.
Yes.
But also we see in 1 Peter chapter 2, don't we? There's a dual focus to government. So if I read out,
please,
1 Peter 2 verses 13 to 14, submit yourself for the Lord's sake. Again, interestingly, but submission to authority is seen within the context of our relationship with God as well.
Yes.
Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. So punishing those who do wrong and commending those who do right. And theologians sometimes talk about it as, I guess, punishing evil, or restraining evil and promoting good.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's stress this, that at CARE we talk a lot about the fact that, good government, which does those things, is God's idea.
Yes.
And as Christians, when we see good government, even if the form of that government is, for example, a pagan emperor like Nero, then we should commend the government when they get things right.
Yeah.
And we should be a critical friend when they get things wrong. And it's in that spirit that you can then approach the King's Speech. And I also would stress that I want to come at this not first and foremost as a political supporter of a particular party myself, but rather I come at it as a citizen of God's kingdom, as a follower of Jesus. And so I will have my own political instincts for how we're to work out biblical principles when it comes to politics in this world. But my first identity is I follow Jesus, I'm a citizen of heaven, and that allows me then to not compromise myself in saying there are things here that a Labour government, or indeed if it was a Conservative government, there are things that this government are doing that I think are consistent with Romans 13.
Yeah, and actually I sort of feel like having one eye on that dual focus is a good thing, because we often talk as Christians about all the negative things which we want governments to not do. So we want them to not decriminalise abortion. And we've got to kind of stop abortion. They can't introduce assisted suicide because we need to make sure that they don't kind of endanger the vulnerable.
Or we want them to ban this and ban that and stop this and stop that. It's all very negative.
Exactly. And actually, when we sort of think actually there is that dual focus, well, the fact that one of Labour's 5 key priorities is to promote equal opportunity for all, which recognises that the kind of fundamental truth that all humans are made in God's image and therefore are of equal dignity and worth, even if that is subconsciously recognised, that is a really good thing. And so actually sort of thinking both restrain evil and promote good, we want to check for both of those
absolutely.
in the bills which are put forward.
And then so you add to that, Genesis 9, government have a responsibility to protect life, to punish what is evil, which must be punish what is evil according to God's standard of what is evil, by and large, and then also promote what is good. I think you would say as well, I want to approach this and say, are there examples of legislation here where I think the government is overstepping the boundaries that I think God has designed, which is to say there are other authority structures in this world. Kuyper, the Dutch theologian, called it spheres of sovereignty. And for example, the church have been given the keys of the kingdom. The government have been given the sword of judgment. The family is another authority structure that God has designed. And so I do want to have that lens on as well. And that means when I come across something which on first hearing sounds fantastic, which is the fact that they're going to introduce a children's well-being bill, I look at that and I go, I like the sound of a lot of that. I instinctively think, yes, because Jesus loves little children, they matter to him, we should care about them. And sadly, there are many, many horrific stories of children being abused, exploited, and going missing in the care system. But there is going to be part of my antennae that hears that and just goes, I also just want to check that what doesn't happen with that bill is that the government and the state end up encroaching on rights and responsibilities that I think biblically belong not to government but to parents. And that's not a Labour or a Conservative point. That is I think a Christian citizen way of looking at the children's wellbeing bill.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. I guess I have a couple of things just to kind of say as we round off this little section. We've talked in past episodes about the emphasis on making sure that governments look out for the vulnerable. Yes. And so we want to see a particular priority on that, just as we see that God has on his heart a particular priority, which is for rulers to look after the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, and the poor. And so we want to make sure that is still happening. And I think we also we were having a discussion on this.
Yeah, we were.
In terms of quite what our wording was. We would love to see government. I guess we would love to see a government which honours God. And Christians disagree as to quite what that looks like. I think we certainly want to see a government which is perfectly happy about Christian faith and not looking to play down its significance. I think we would want to see a government which is happy to have within it people of Christian faith as well, rather than saying, oh, no, we can't trust those nasty Christians over there. So it's encouraging to us, I think, when we see, for instance, that Stephen Timms has been made a minister. That's a really good thing. Any other thoughts on that one?
No, I think the only other thing I'd say is, again, coming back to 1 Timothy 2 and a passage that we've probably read more times than any other on this podcast, but understandably, because it's so explicitly about praying for those in authority. But I constantly want to make the point that it's connected to that we might live quiet lives in godliness and holiness, which you were talking about earlier, and that this is good, it pleases God our Saviour. I mean, that's not Paul just, what should I call God in this sentence? Like, that's very deliberate, because it's framed around, God, our Saviour, who wants people to be saved. And so there is that sense too of, I want to look at this list of bills, and I'm just, part of my antennae is going, are any of these potentially going to limit gospel freedom? And so even I remember under the last government when they introduced an online safety bill in I think it was a Queen's speech back then that was one of the things that just made my antennae go, because I thought, yep, a lot there that I connect with and I really can support, but I do have a question over if they appoint a regulator for the online world, will that regulator overstep and end up actually silencing Christians alongside silencing genuinely hateful speech online? So that's the kind of way I want to approach this. So it's trying to say, I don't want to come at a King's speech and approach it just through a party political lens.
Yeah.
I actually want to come at it as a citizen of heaven and go, what here do I think is going to promote human flourishing and human good and human dignity? And what do I think is going to actually cause problems?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Why don't we...
It sounds so common sense, doesn't it? So, yes. But I think there's a really important point there, just before we come to the bills, which is, and we were talking about this earlier, I also think a danger that we have to avoid at this stage is oversimplifying everything and creating very black and white categories. When you look at a bill, even the conversion practices bill, the draft one, to my mind, I look at that and part of it is black and white. I think a broad conversion practices ban is black, that is, it's wrong because it will infringe on fundamental rights and freedom of speech and so on. However, the heart behind it, the intention behind it, I think in part is good. They want to stop harmful practices. They want to stop people being hurt. And I kind of think, hold on, I can connect with that as a Christian. And so there are shades of grey when it comes to assessing public policy from a Christian perspective, and there's often layers of good and bad woven together in one single piece of legislation. And so it's very rare that as a Christian in public policy world, I would look at something and go, I wholly object to this in every single part.
We were saying earlier, weren't we, how like no government puts forward a bill because we think actually this is a really bad bill. They are trying to do something good in it.
They're not the Emperor Palpatine. You know, I mean, even he tried to do some good. You know,
it's like in The Lord of the Rings when people say actually Saruman was really good for workforce. He was providing employment.
Great technology. You know, they were at the cutting edge.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you wanted to actually. We should talk about some of the bills, shouldn't we?
Yes. Even I feel like our time is really limited, but let's kind of whip through some of the big headlines.
Okay. Let's do it. So the first big headline is economic stability and growth. Big number of bills here. I think I counted earlier something like, was it 16? One anyway. Okay, so I look at that and I go, okay, look, budget responsibility bill, making sure that all governments have to properly use what's called the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility. Yep, I think that's probably a good idea.
Yes, I mean, this one is clearly targeted at Conservatives, isn't it?
Yes.
In that, like, the civil service briefing at one point had a direct reference to Liz Truss, which she objected to.
Yes, she's written to the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case, and then he's replied saying it's been removed, and she's rewritten asking a whole load of questions about how did this happen,
which is fair. In terms of civil service neutrality, it's completely fair enough. Although I must say, I did laugh somewhat at the person who put on Twitter, perhaps you should contact your MP to complain. But putting that to one side.
Yes. Ooh, yes, you're absolutely right. Targeted at the Tories. Oh gosh, that's a low blow. National Wealth Fund as well. I mean, I think again a good idea. Other countries have done that very successfully and squirreled away. For example, Norway have done it. They particularly focused on kind of North Sea oil. They've squirreled away lots of money from that. Sweden have done it as well. So again, if it's done well, that could be a good thing.
We don't necessarily have to look at all of these.
Oh no, sorry, no. I just picked those two because I had something to say about them.
Okay.
But also, I do think I want to talk about better buses. I do think that matters. Buses matter. They help connect communities.
Well, absolutely. Wouldn't it? I mean, some of these things again were promised, weren't they? So things like the bill to do with nationalising the railways. That has been known for some time, and again, you can understand the heart behind something, and the question is, what is going to work best in the long run?
Absolutely.
Because on one level, sometimes I have found my rail fares with going with a private company have not been great.
Nope.
But the question is this going to actually provide better money for the taxpayer in the long run? And the proof is in the pudding.
Absolutely.
On lots of this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as we travel down as well, I noticed like the water special measures bill. So making sure that there were particular emergency responses to make sure if water companies end up in great financial difficulty that there are measures that can be implemented. I think that matters enormously. I'm furious that my water bill is going to go up, I think, because of chronic mismanagement by water companies.
But also, I think one of the good things within that bill is the way in which they are planning on effectively holding to account those who lead those water companies. And so they will be personally responsible and will be hit with fines and won't be allowed a bonus if say their water company has been dumping sewage in outside of stormy season. Well, that's a really good kind of common sense way to deal with something.
And consistent, I think, with biblical principles around making sure that leaders are held to account.
Completely.
And on that connection, I think the Hillsborough law, which they're going to introduce, is a really good thing because it places a new duty of candour on public servants. And the heart behind this is saying there's been too much defensiveness, too much cover-up. And I think, yes, actually, I think they're right in their diagnosis. And therefore, I think this new duty is a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
Biblically, when it comes to leadership, character matters as much, if not arguably more, than your actual gifting and skills. And so I think, there's something I think we can get behind on there as well. What about the border security, asylum and immigration bill? Because you've written a little bit about immigration from a Christian perspective.
Yeah, I have. It's really difficult, I think, to provide solutions to some of these problems. And actually, Labour have put forward their plan, and today, as on the day of recording, Emmanuel Macron releases this statement basically sort of saying there is no quick fix to kind of boats crossing the channel. And that is realistically going to be true. There will be no quick fix to doing something. It's certainly very different tonally to the approach the Conservatives took. So the Conservatives were effectively planning on deporting illegal immigrants. In a sort of like deport first, ask questions later kind of approach. And we had real concerns about that in terms of the impact which that might have on victims of modern slavery. The approach from Labour is somewhat different. It's effectively to try and crack down on the gangs. I was reading a little bit about it earlier, and actually some of the approach I thought was quite interesting in that it's sort of modelled on the way in which governments have tried to combat terrorism, which is not to just prosecute someone when they've committed a terrorist act, but to actually get them in the planning stage.
Yes.
So when a terrorist is like buying their explosive devices, that's your point when you can get them.
Yes.
And it's similar with that in terms of trying to stop the small boats. It's just as soon as you see someone is doing the actions, which means that they are planning to put people on small boats,
get them.
That is the time to interact. And that's quite interesting.
And the language that they've used as well around a new kind of border command and looking to get someone who actually ran anti-terrorism activities in the UK to run that. They actually said no, but you can see that same kind of approach that they take, the kind of how do we handle terrorism, let's apply that to small boats crisis.
And again, the proof really is going to be in the pudding, in that you sort of think, well, actually, as much as it might sound like some great new approach from Labour, it's not like the Conservatives haven't tried cracking down on criminal gangs before. And the question is, will Labour have more success? So it's not just Conservatives bad, Labour good at all. It is actually the Conservatives tried one approach and they didn't manage to make it work. Labour's trying some of the same things and some different things. Will they have more success? We'll find out.
Yeah, exactly. Also, I noted the Renters' Rights Bill. I think what's interesting there is there's such a crisis in terms of the availability of rental properties, but there is also a sense that the previous government wanted to make things more fair for those who are renting, and I think rightly so. I mentioned the draft leasehold and common hold reform bill. I think the whole thing around planning and building houses matters because I do think there is a biblical principle around being able to put down roots and to be able to kind of stabilize yourself at a certain stage in your life. And I wonder whether that will also encourage longer term commitment potentially between couples, but also I think it creates generally speaking, a better environment for raising children as well. And so all of these are good things from a biblical perspective. And so that'll be interesting. I think one more that kind of jumped out at me, which is the whole thing around the mental health bill and reforming the Mental Health Act. And I think that's one of those things where practice is constantly changing and updating as we understand a little bit more about how our brains work, about mental health. And I recognize that within the Christian community, there is legitimate debate to be had around diagnosing mental health and treating it as well. But I think the broad principles of the Mental Health Bill are really good. And I think they they rightly are seeking to recognise that we do understand more now, and mental health is a real issue that needs to be addressed, and we need to provide more funding for treatment, but we also need to make sure that some of the ways in which people who present with mental health illness are treated, that they're still afforded the same level of dignity as if they were completely able-bodied and their mind was completely clear of any mental illness.
And actually, while we're on the area of health, and then we probably ought to sort of start wrapping up, I actually thought it was quite encouraging in some ways that Labour was going to bring back the smoking ban, which Rishi Sunak initially put forward, and then ran out of time to actually do because he called an election. And the reason I say it's encouraging is it shows a government which is not looking to just do the opposite of what the last government did for its own sake. It is saying, actually, we think this policy proposal is a good idea, and therefore we're not going to play party politics with it. We're going to push it forward regardless. And that was one of the encouraging things I actually thought in the tone of the debate around the King's speech was Rishi Sunak came out and sort of said, look, we're not going to oppose you for our own sake either. We wish you all the best because we want to serve our country, and we recognise that we have much in common in that regard, and we recognise we are all patriots and we're all trying to serve the people of the UK. If there are things to challenge, then we will do that too. And it was really nice, wasn't it, actually, to see some of those shots of Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, Angela Rayner, I think it was Oliver Dowden as well, before the debate, where they were chatting completely civilly, actually laughing with one another at points. And it's so different to a general election, because in some ways I sometimes think an election brings out the worst in politics, because it's all about saying we're the ones you should elect, therefore you can't trust those people over there. They will do so many bad things. And actually you see when you get things like this, actually it's not like that febrile atmosphere all the time.
No, and you know, we talk a lot about truth and grace, convicted civility. That was on display, I think, in parts of that debate, and hopefully that continues. And I don't see any reason why it can't. That's a political will decision that, you know, and we'll come on to, I'm sure, the future leadership of the Tory party and future podcasts that they have to make. Plenty more that we could say. Look, I would really encourage you, if you've enjoyed this, do head to our website, care.org.uk, because we have an article that analyses the King's speech and gives those biblical principles that we talked about earlier. There's also just a short summary. If 2,000 words is too long for you, there's a much shorter piece just summarising some of the key highlights, also at care.org.uk, which is really exciting. You were about to say?
Yes, so just to clarify, that's our main Care website now. So unlike in previous episodes where we've been advertising the Engage website, do head to our main Care website.
Definitely. And if you're enjoying this podcast, then please do subscribe to our YouTube channel at Care.org UK, because this is the way that you can get alerts about when we're going live, when premieres happen, and just access all of the incredible content that we think we're putting on YouTube, with more still to come. Keep letting us know what you like about this podcast. Keep asking us questions. We will continue to endeavour to ignore them and talk about what we want to talk about. No, I'm only joking. We will endeavour to answer them. But as ever in this engaged podcast world, Peter, it's been a pleasure. I'll see you next time.
See you soon.